Our next speaker is Georgia Dienst, who did work for a few years at the Google X laboratories. We won't talk about it much, but we'll try and coax a little bit out of it about that later. Focusing now, as I understand it, on the whole field of potentially neural implants, ways of augmenting human intelligence. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, I'm here to talk to you about the weird and wonderful future of humanity, the merging of man and machine, the so-called singularity, or more precisely, computer-brain interfaces. But for you to really understand where we're at today, I think it's important that I give you a little bit of context about where we have come from. So the hope for a long time has been to control the brains, or our brains, from the outside and to better understand them. Some of the earliest brain surgeries were mere holes into the brain. This is the first brain interface in a skull. Some of the earliest findings of these sort of skulls date 5,000 years before Christ, so a long time, across all continents and ethnicities. At the time, it was considered sort of a way to let an evil spirit out of somebody's brain and help people be a little bit more normal. The crazy thing about this is that here in the UK, this became really fashionable in the 60s and 70s amongst hippies who popped down to the local hardware store and bought a drill and actually drilled a hole into their own skull, thinking that a bit less pressure into the brain would actually create a sort of continuous natural high. Now, if this sounds funny to you, go onto YouTube and Google do-it-yourself trepanation, because you'll find a ton of videos of these hippies describing how they did this, often under the influence of LSD. And I highly recommend not doing this at home. The second time we decided to sort of control the brain from the outside is when not only we made a hole into the skull, no, we decided to actually grab a little bit of the brain, the part of the brain that was supposedly not functioning so well, and actually cut parts out of the prefrontal lobe. As you might imagine, that didn't really help a lot for the person that had this surgery. They were often left into a vegetative state or lost a huge amount of their intelligence or personality. Strangely enough, there was a Nobel Prize that was given to a Portuguese neurologist called Anteo Mondies in 1949. At the end of the 50s, we decided, okay, enough of this, and we stopped these procedures. Now, we still had this desire to control the brain from the outside, so we started opening the skull and putting different electrodes into various parts of the brain and electrifying the brain. We started doing this on animals, and then we proceeded to go to humans. There was a crazy guy in Spain who actually put them into a bull and let him go race in the bullfight, and he would race towards the torero, and he'd press the button and zap the bull, and he would stop in mid-course. So this was considered very entertaining at the time. Crazy enough, this is kind of the technology that we use in humans these days. This device is about 20 years old. It is called a deep brain stimulation device. And there's around 200,000 to 300,000 people in the world that actually have this device implanted in their brain. So the sort of bit that you can see that goes into the brain, at the bottom of it, there's very small electrodes which send out electrical stimulation to, in this case, the motor cortex. And then the cable runs under the skin to a battery pack that sits kind of under the collarbone. Now, this is being used for, especially for Parkinson's and epilepsy. And you might want to ask yourself, why these two? Two reasons. One, by sort of chance and accident, we figured out how to put this into the motor cortex and that it would actually control tremors as well as epileptic fits. The second is less talked about, and that is really, it is so obvious that the thing works. And I'll show you a video of a patient who's actually here in the UK who's been having a device like this inside his brain for multiple years, and you can see how incredibly effective it is.
I'm not making happy little faces for the video. These are tests that the neurologists make us do to test our reflexes. As you can see, they're wiggling, moving fine, and I've got very good movement. This is the remote control, and this checks that I'm on. On and OK. And this is me when I turn it off. You won't be able to read that, it's shaking too much. So it's almost an instantaneous reaction. I can't control this. It shakes some quality cocktails with the right. The left just looks like the royal wave. My voice is gone. It's harder for me to get words out and speak. I'm completely rigid, and if I tried to stand up I'd fall. If anyone thinks I'm faking this, I'm not. I can't control the tremors and dyskinesia. The twisting in my neck is called dystonia and is really quite uncomfortable. So as you can see, the tremors are getting much worse and I'm in quite a bit of discomfort, and I'm about to drop the remote control, which will be fun because I won't be able to turn my stuff back on. So I think party time is over. Almost automatically the power comes back on. I'm steady.
So as you can see, this works incredibly for patients who have advanced Parkinson's or epilepsy. What you cannot see in this video is that you can see sort of the hand that has a lot more stability, but at the same time, patients will say that they not only have a hard time to actually speak, but even to hold on to thoughts, so even to sort of string thought together is incredibly difficult, and with this sort of stimulation, they can actually think well. And so now the question we need to ask ourselves is, if we can put something into the brain and stimulate for these kind of things, what else might we do? Could we stimulate and treat pain or depression or sadness? Well, we hit a major milestone in the UK in May, where for the first time DBS has been approved for obesity. Now this is really interesting for two reasons. One, it means that actually we're taking addictions out of the pot of sort of like psychological illness and putting it into the pot of neurological diseases. But secondly, we are really looking at, okay, what are we actually doing here? We are actually stimulating and manipulating desire, and desire is the predecessor to a decision. So when we get hungry, before we get hungry, we have the desire for food, we have the desire to drink something. And so this is really for the first time where from the outside, we are controlling the decision-making process of a human being. And so again, we need to ask ourselves, here's one of them says, we might be able to manipulate pain and also depression. The question is, who are we to decide what is a good emotion and what is a bad emotion? And if we get rid of sadness and depression and sort of the more melancholic emotions, do we get rid of all the art and the music and all the other things that get written or produced under these emotions? Well, that's something we'll have to see. Let me give you an introduction to the technologies that are currently being worked on. There's three types. There's non-invasive, there's semi-invasive, and there's fully invasive. The non-invasive approach is, there are two technologies that you might have heard about or that you know of, which is EEG, which is sort of a cap that you wear with electrodes on it. It is widely available, it is relatively cheap, it's just not very precise. The second one is an fMRI. If any of you had been in one of those, these massive machines where you get put on a bar, you get pushed in, makes a ton of noise, but it's very expensive and incredibly precise. So whoever is gonna, and it doesn't lend itself to continuous monitoring of neural data, which is ultimately what we would need to better understand what actually happens in our brain on a continuous basis. The second is semi-invasive, so that's sort of like an earpiece that you'd wear, sort of half in, half out. Not that much being done in that space. And then you have fully invasive, which is what I've just talked about the deep brain stimulation device. At the same time, the device that I just showed you is about 20 years old, so I think it's ripe for a disruption. The tricky thing with all of these things is the thing called the skull. As you can see, the outer and the inner layer are incredibly dense. The middle bit is not so much. They're actually getting information in and outside of the brain, may it be electrical or light or sound waves, is incredibly hard and getting a good signal out. It is clearly not stopping anyone. There's a ton of individuals who've made a lot of money, as well as corporations and research labs who are currently trying to get into the brain. It's sort of the last frontier. It's sort of crazy that we've been to the moon, but we still don't actually know how our brain really works. So let me introduce you to the 5 top companies that are sort of at the front of this race into the brain and that are really got the biggest chance of succeeding. The first company, you know it all. You might not know that they're actually trying to get into your brain, and it is Facebook. Facebook is indeed working on a non-invasive technology, which is called thinking, not typing. What they're trying to do is build a non-invasive technology, so a sort of hat or a device you'd wear around your ear that allows you to just think and then convert that straight into sort of typing in a computer, which would make it 5 times faster instead of typing via a keyboard. This isn't about decoding random thoughts, so Facebook says. This is about decoding the words you've already decided to share by sending them to the speech center of your brain. Facebook links this to sort of like how we take lots and lots of pictures, but only share very selected few. Even with this device, Facebook says, you'll be able to think freely, but only turn some thoughts into text. I hope you're all thinking what I'm thinking. So having a company that has 1.8 billion users in the world building something like this is obviously quite scary. And if you think Cambridge Analytica was a problem, I can tell you this is going to be a much bigger problem. The second and the third company I want to talk about is Neuralink and Kernel, who I had the opportunity of working with. Neuralink is Elon Musk. He loves just going into the spaces that are the most difficult. And both of these companies are majoritively trying to go fully invasive. They're also dabbling in some non-invasive. But ultimately, what they are trying to do is take the device that I talked about earlier and give it a real update. So what does that mean? Currently, the way that it stimulates a part of the motor cortex is incredibly crude, like it just blasts electricity, sort of a little bit like a heart pacemaker. So the question is, can we build something that is incredibly precise, that can stimulate less neurons at one given point in time, and that can also record neural data, so kind of listen into the brain what is actually happening. At the same time, you would then have to have an artificial intelligence in there and a sort of Wi-Fi signal that could beam all of this up to the cloud, so make sense of the data and then transmit it to somewhere. So if you think Steve Jobs had a difficult job with putting 10,000 songs into your pocket, let me tell you, like this is one of the most complex things we'll ever attempted at building. So you have neuroscientists, hardware engineers, electrical engineers, and data scientists trying to put something into your brain which has to stay there for 20 or 30 years. Elon Musk recently gave an interview. It's relatively famous now because he was actually drunk and high while he gave the interview, where he said he's going to have a huge breakthrough that he's going to talk to the world about soon. With regards to Neuralink, what is believed is that he's going to release that they have actually recorded brain data of sheep. We don't know if this is true or false, but yeah, we shall see. The next company is a company called OpenWater by Mary-Lou Jepson. She's an optic expert and is using red and benign infrared, which penetrates our flesh and bones to see potentially and stimulate what's inside in our brains. They are really at the forefront of optical physics and utilizing light and sound to track humors, measure neural activity, and they could possibly replace the fMRI machine with a cheaper and more efficient and wearable solution. She held this TED Talk in March, and I can highly recommend watching this. I think we will see a huge amount of innovation coming out of laser, sound, and light technologies in the years to come. last but not least, we have DARPA. DARPA is the research arm of the US military, which basically means they have unlimited budgets and are funding or giving out grants to research labs, science universities, and startups in the space all across America. Now, you might well ask, well, why are they doing this? Well, it's kind of obvious. There's a more benevolent reason, which they have a ton of soldiers that come back out of war with a loss of limbs, and so they're trying to build smart new arms and legs, as well as try and deal with soldiers who have severe PTSD. The second is not so benevolent. They're really trying to create non-invasive technologies that would basically superpower their able-bodied soldiers. So this means helmets that basically prohibit the soldier of having any fear, or through mere forethought would be able to control a flying drone. As you can imagine, that would change warfare entirely. Now, the other thing with DARPA is that they often fund a lot of research that is meant for the military, but then actually trickles into mainstream. So I truly believe we will see in the next 5-10 years a lot of this non-invasive neural technology that they are funding coming into mainstream. So what does this mean for the future? We are very much at the beginning of this journey. The technologies that we have just talked about, non-invasive and fully invasive, are very much in the infancies of where they are. Ideally, we would want to build smarter devices that would go into the brains of those that actually have a neurological disease and are severely suffering because of it. Even the people that actually have the deep brain stimulation device are only the top 5 or 10, like the top 5 to 10% who have severe issues. You don't very easily just have an open brain surgery and put this device in. But what we'd want to have smarter devices that could, while they are helping the person, actually listening to neural data and actually record, and therefore we could learn the language of the brain. Now, I think there are, in an ideal world, let's say this all goes incredibly well over the next 20, 30 years, and we truly become gods. We have these chips in our brains. We can download whatever language we want. We can become intelligently enhanced. We can physically enhanced. And we truly have, we've reached the status of gods. We are far away from this, but I'm telling you, a lot of people are already talking about this kind of reality. What we do need to remember is that human intelligence has developed over millions of years. And what science is currently talking about a lot is that it's not only the brain that actually makes our decisions. It is very much our gut as well, and the microbiome is playing a huge role in how we take everyday decisions. The question ultimately, or the conversations, becomes a very philosophical conversation. Are we able to make good and bad decisions? And are we today much further along since the times that we drilled holes into our skull? Alan Turing, in 1952, was prosecuted to chemical castration because of his desire for men. He decided to be with men, and he was therefore chemically castrated. So the question to ask ourselves, if we start putting these devices into people's brain and manipulating their desire for things, are we in a much better position to decide what is a good and what is a bad decision today? If you ask anybody who's building autonomous vehicles, they'll tell you how incredibly hard it is to actually teach morals and values and proper decision-making to these autonomous vehicles. So as I said, we are a far cry away from these technologies being in our life. At the same time, I think it's important we start asking ourselves the important questions. Questions like, do we feel comfortable for Facebook to read our thoughts? Do we feel comfortable for them to own our neural data? What does that mean about privacy? Do we have privacy? Potentially, we could put all of our neural data onto the blockchain, and then I can share my little bit of neural data with my husband, or with my friends, or with a government, or with a company through smart contracts. Is that a solution? How is the jurisdiction system going to work if you have a person that has a device in its brain and he commits a crime, like who committed the crime? Who's responsible? How is hacking going to work on mass scale? How's the schooling system going to work if you have some children that are technologically enhanced and others are not? These are really big questions, and they are well far away of a reality. And the question is, will we ask ourselves these sort of questions in 20 years? Because we don't even know if those are the questions that are going to be important then. But in policy, these are the questions that come up. Now, I will leave you with a quote that ultimately speaks about a conundrum that we've been talking about for the longest time, and that is free will. And decision-making ultimately is a question around free will. And once we have technologies in our brain, free will be more important. The quote is by Arthur Schopenhauer, and the quote goes, "Man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants." Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you very much. Literally mind-blowing. Thank you for that. You've touched on so many fascinating things. You mentioned about schooling, technological implants. Some kids have them, some don't. I mean, this is an incredibly fundamental question about equality, I guess,
right.
in the human race,
right.
which takes you back to sort of Orwell and Aldous Huxley and,
yeah.
and all of that. I mean, do you think that because you and others are raising this now, in other words, there can be a public debate well ahead of this becoming reality, we can get the management right? Or is the technology going to move so fast that we'll actually be playing catch-up?
Well, I think we have to raise these discussions, especially this one that you mentioned, because I think if anybody is familiar with genetic engineering or CRISPR technologies, these are exactly the same questions we have to ask ourselves. The issue is obviously government, ultimately, and whether government can move fast enough on these sort of regulatory issues. I think currently it's not looking like they're moving fast enough, because at least in the sort of genetic engineering space, we're seeing these just pop up and people just injecting themselves with all sorts of crazy viruses to see if they can change something about their gene code. But we'll have the same issue here at some point.
So will you be surprised or not surprised if in the coming 10 years, somewhere in the world, people just start fitting themselves with some device?
Well, that is happening in the genetic space. I would say it's a little bit easier to take a needle and inject yourself than actually open your brain and put something in there. I mean, as I said, there's these videos out there, but actually having an open skull surgery is a pretty big decision to have. So I'm not seeing that being like a home kit in the near future, but I think there are crazy people who like to do all sorts of things, so we don't know.
We don't know. That's sort of the human trait, isn't it? Hey, Georgia, many, many thanks indeed. It's terrific. Thank you.